Well, my name is Dick Bernard, and I've been part of the Twin Cities community since 1965, and in the peace movement for about a dozen years now. I became active after 9/11, 2001. In fact, the reason I became active in the peace movement was when we began bombing Afghanistan. It's somewhat ironic because we're talking now about disengaging from Afghanistan after all these years. But in October of 2001, we began to bomb Afghanistan to attack the Taliban, or Al-Qaeda. I guess we attacked both Al-Qaeda and the Taliban, because Taliban was in the leadership role in Afghanistan at the time and was harboring Al-Qaeda. And at the time, I can remember, this was about a month after 9/11, that I could not see anything good coming out of this. I just could not see any good outcome from bombing this country. There were no Afghanis who were involved in 9/11. At least, you know, the planes and so forth. It just didn't seem like there was anything good that we would come out of it. At the time, I can recall reading a newspaper article that there were only 6% of Americans who agreed with me on that issue. So I was in a very distinct minority. There were hardly any people that were not wanting to get some kind of retaliation against somebody as a result of 9/11. My background, I spent 27 years representing school teachers in Minnesota, a teachers union representative. And before that, I was a school teacher for 9 years. And I retired in 2000 from that profession and began working as a volunteer within the peace movement. And essentially, I'm still active in the peace movement, though I have some differences from time to time with ways things have been done. I come from I always say this, and it is always somewhat a tense statement when you're talking to a peacemaker. I come from a military background. My Uncle Frank was one of those who went down in the U.S. Arizona at Pearl Harbor, December 7th, 41. He's my dad's brother, my dad's youngest brother. I don't think he ever got over it. I have a lot of military relatives from the past. Two of my brothers are retired military officers. I'm an Army veteran myself, and what I decided to do today was to wear what we call the dog tags from my military service, which is over 50 years old. I don't think that impacts at all on my motivation for peace. I was not in conflict. I just have to acknowledge it as a part of my reality. I have been part of a military environment my whole life, in a sense. From my teacher association work, representing teachers, I was very much like a lawyer. So my entire existence was involved in trying to resolve problems and trying to find some semblance of fact out of all of the versions of truth that were portrayed by people who had complaints of one sort or another. And so almost by nature, I tend to look at alternative scenarios and try to find what isn't being said behind the statements that are made in support of or against something or other. It's just part of who I am. And I guess that's about where I would stop for the moment.
So, Dick, you had a military background. You had seen war from the very close proximity. You had seen one of your uncles going down in Pearl Harbor. What took you so long to start working actively on peace?
Well, you know, I haven't thought a great deal about that. But I've always had a sense of being a peaceful person. The first active event that I could remember, and I can remember it pretty vividly, was I was in Washington, D.C. in October or November of 1982, and I happened to be in Washington, D.C. the weekend that the Vietnam Memorial was dedicated on the mall, the famous Vietnam Memorial. And I went to that, and it was a very moving time, and it occurred to me then that I had not even acknowledged my brother's service in that war. Both of them were Vietnam veterans. I was in early Vietnam, and I wrote them a long letter on the way home on the plane from Washington to here. Before that, I think in most cases I had seen that war was necessary. I come from the World War II generation, where it was generally believed by people my age that we did the right thing, that we had to do the right thing to bring the peace from the Nazis and from Japan. I didn't think a whole lot about it. It just, I certainly was never a war maker. I didn't especially like the Army, but I considered Army service was something I was supposed to do, and I did it. That may not be an adequate answer, but that's about the best I can do.
So once you started working on peace, what did you realize? What was the reasons behind America's expansionist, interventionist, imperialistic policies?
Well, and I've always been interested in history, and the question about what was behind all of these things is very complex and really goes back to the beginning of our country. You know, we were born out of revolution against England initially, and then there's been a succession of acquisitions since then. Louisiana Purchase was not a result of war, but we bought a third of the United States. We went to war against the Spaniards. And I think probably, if I was going to be more specific, it was probably in the early 1900s, more so than any other time, around Teddy Roosevelt's time, where we became interventionist. We had spheres of influence that were ever greater. Spanish-American War, in which my grandfather was a soldier in the Philippines, was basically a war of acquisition. By the time he came, he was one of the first Americans to the Philippines in the Spanish-American War, and by the time he arrived there, the Spanish had already been defeated. The war that he fought was against the insurgents, the Filipinos, who were said, "Thank you very much for coming, but you can go home now." And we just made the Philippines a territory, and it was our sort of our western beachhead. And I'm sure that caused some grief for the Japanese, who are not that far away from the Philippines. And I think all of these things tend to tie together over time. We got an appetite for expanding our influence. We built military bases that we never took down in World War II. We went into Korea for, I think, probably justifiable reasons, but then MacArthur decided he wanted to go into China, and he was fired as general at that point in time. Then we went into Vietnam, which we should never have gone into in the first place. We just keep getting sucked into this environment. I've often said that we're a nation that's become so accustomed to war that we have really difficulty in changing the story to working for peace. I'm a very peaceful person. the last person that you would think of as a warmonger, but my entire story is around people that have done things in war.
Is there any special interest which is pushing United States to war, especially in recent years? As we remember, Eisenhower used to say military-industrial complex and things like that.
Well, it very definitely a military-industrial complex is the engine that drives this. There's a lot of money to be made in military things. Ships, guns, ammunition. It creates a lot of jobs. It's in every state. There's no place where there isn't the military-industrial complex kind of activity. And I think I was a senior in college when Eisenhower made his speech about the military-industrial complex on television. And it was rather a well-thought-out speech, and he was the general of the Army in World War II. So it was a speech that we paid attention to. He was concerned about the marriage between the government, the military, and industry as not being a good thing. But he was basically ignored. You know, in our government system, the Congress is the one that appropriates the funds. The president has limited authority to deal with those kind of things if they would want to deal with them. And it just keeps getting larger and larger. There isn't any politician who would actively go against getting rid of jobs by closing down some factory that makes tanks or munitions. It feeds on itself. And our national budget, I think, the discretionary budget is probably 50% of it's related to military costs in one way or another.
So going back to where we started, when you started working on peace in the wake of 9/11 attacks, how did you start working? What strategy you adopted then?
Well, you know, initially I wasn't involved. I think I've said that already. It was sort of new for me, so I didn't know the people in the movement. And I can remember the first thing that I did, which was in the week of the bombing of Afghanistan, which was the very first week of October. There was a demonstration I heard about at the state capitol, and I went over to it just to see what was going on. It was in the early evening, I can remember, and there were maybe 200 people on the Capitol steps. And across the street from them were a bunch of very angry people brandishing American flags, the anti-war people, so to speak. And I don't recall any of the speakers. I don't recall specifically what the speeches were about. I didn't know anybody there at all. But that was really my first overt action in peace. Then I became active in a group that I didn't know at the time, but was later to become known to me as Minnesota Alliance of Peacemakers, a consortium of groups that were allied for peace and justice issues. And I later became president of that group for 3 years in the mid-2000s, and I'm still active in it. In fact, there's a meeting coming up tomorrow of the group, and I'll probably stay engaged with it. But that was basically became my focus. So I would go to demonstrations. As time went on, I started to drop out of the demonstrations. I wasn't seeing them as being productive. I thought there were other ways of doing things for using that much time, and but I'm still involved, and I'll never be uninvolved in it.
How did you express yourself?
At the demonstrations?
No, I mean, I know that you do blogging and things like that, so this question is in reference to those things. So how do you express yourself, your point of views and different political issues and other issues?
Well, for me, my basic outlet has always been writing. So with respect to peace issues, I wrote quite a number of articles that were published in the Minneapolis Star-Tribune beginning in 2002. Now, of course, you don't just send something to the Star-Tribune and get it published. You know, there's a lot of competition for news space, and then you have to go up against whatever the editorial policy of the paper is. But I can say that I probably had at least a half dozen columns published in the Star-Tribune, and almost all of them were on the general topic of pro-peace or anti-war. I see there's a distinction between pro-peace and anti-war, but that's basically how I would express myself. And then I became a leader of the Minnesota Alliance of Peacemakers, so I had a little bit of chance to at least have a little more influence on what people were doing, but still I was just one person.
When was your last, and you haven't mentioned about your blog.
Oh, I blogged a great deal. I have written, I do a blog now, outsidethewalls.org/blog. I've done that since 2009. I write about many things, but a lot of them are about peace. The one I did today, or Saturday, was about peace. Before that, I did another blog, which is no longer on the internet. I've always written. I'm just I just express myself in writing. That's what I do.
And when was your last article published in Star Tribune?
Well, it's been harder to get things published in the Star Tribune, and the reason is that, in my opinion, it depends on who owns the newspaper and what their political slant might be. I'm saying, I would guess it was probably 2 or 3 years ago when I would have had the last piece published that would relate to the peace issue. But it is significant to get columns published, and I did have a number of those over the years. And I could still submit them, but it doesn't mean they'll be published.
So they're not taking your columns anymore, or you
Well,
are no more interested?
You know, that's... You understand, if you do as much writing as I do, that you're not always going to be published. It's a given. But there's a point where you sometimes reach that, where you wonder if it's worthwhile spending the time writing. So what I might do more often now than before is to write my blog, such as the one I wrote on Saturday, and then make more people aware of it and ask them to circulate it to people that they know, to hopefully get a little bit more circulation. As you write, and I write a lot, you begin to learn the rules of the road, as we would say here, of what kinds of things you need to avoid, and the kinds of things that you need to do, and the kind of roadblocks you're going to run into. And there's a certain amount of compromise that you have to make, but at some point in time, if you can't compromise anymore, if you can't express your point of view, at least in some way, and get it published, it's not much worth writing it, because the editor will just not publish what you send in. I'm probably more successful than most people that I know in getting things published, but it is more difficult to get things published in the local papers now than it was before.
But still, it was a great achievement to have published that many articles.
Yeah.
And since you have been a leader at Minnesota Alliance of Peacemakers, have you been able to inspire your own family, your children, your wife to work on the theme of peace?
Well, I think my wife is you know, I don't have to inspire her. She would be inspired by herself. You know, we know the same kind of people. It's a more interesting question when it comes to the children. We have 6 children together and 5 in-laws, and we have the range of political points of view that run from libertarian to very liberal. And we have in-laws, of course, and they have varying opinions. And we have our own families, and they have varying opinions. But I think what we can do, and what we do quietly and sometimes overtly, is just to make sure that they're aware of where we stand personally. This blog I've already mentioned a couple of times. For instance, I will send to my family members. Some of them will read it. You know, some will agree with it. Some won't open it because it's coming from me. But I think we try to make our position known without becoming offensive, you know, where they see us coming and leave the house. You know, you know how politics works in family structures and in small communities. We don't have an unusual one, I don't think. Yeah.
Okay. And since you have been at the top of a big alliance, having more than 70 organizations and individuals working underneath it, so this question has been asked before as well to other persons. What do you find the reason that those many organizations don't cooperate with each other, don't work together, don't have a common agenda, don't make an impact?
Well, it's a quandary, and it's a very frustrating thing for me personally. It's one of the reasons why I've tended to draw back from involvement. If I was going to identify a single factor, I think there are power blocks, you know, people who can achieve power in a particular niche and have a lot of knowledge in that particular niche and are not able or willing to compromise with some other power block that has some other kind of special interest. So the kind of example I would use quite often would be in the alliance, which has a large number of groups. There's people that are interested in environment. There's people that are interested in global relationships. There are people that are interested in peace and in justice. The peace organizations would range from organizations that in their name are against war, you know, and there are other organizations that are in their name for peace. Well, to me, there's a distinction between being against war and pro peace. One is, in my opinion anyway, a reactive response, whereas the other one is a proactive response. You're working for something or you're working against something. And I could go through the whole list of organizations. I once divided them up into 4 groups. There was peace, justice, global relationships, and sustainability. If I took the 75 organizations, they would probably fit in one of those 4 categories. Some of them in 2 of the 4, you know, some maybe even in 3. But they seem to have difficulty finding ways to compromise. One of my big frustrations when I was president and afterwards was to try to have the Minnesota Alliance of Peacemakers, I emphasize the word alliance, become an organization where it would have some collective power, you know, working as a group. And there was not sufficient interest to do that. I think that's changing. It's a part of a process, but it hasn't changed yet.
But now that you have again become active in these things, and we will also say that you have started working with us as well. You have came across so many people, you have heard their point of views. So do you think that you would become more active again this time? You would work for the unity of those persons who are working and organizations who are working on these things and may produce something different than before?
Well, I don't. I've always been active, and I always will be active. What this process, these interviews, has done for me is to renew some energy that I was losing, to try to, engage more actively and moving forward. I have a particular objective that I've been working on most recently, and that is to bridge the gap between older people like myself, which are mostly the peace movement today, and the younger people who organize in different ways than we do. We didn't know of Facebook, for instance. We just didn't know about it. So the kids do things differently than we do, and to try to figure out some way of bridging that gulf. I had you as facilitator at the World Law Day. That was one of the first specific activities where I tried to bring a youthful voice to a elder audience. And I remember that one person who spoke that night that said that that was the first time she'd ever been asked to speak to about her own feelings and aspirations, and that was a significant accomplishment. One of the outgrowths of this particular activity, these interviews, is I'm going to ask the people who were interviewed if they would be willing to get together as a group subsequent to the end of this activity, just to talk about what it means to them, and then maybe to bridge out from there with other kinds of formal activities to make it live on past just sitting at a table for a few minutes and talking about peace, to help them. Because I've sat in on all of these interviews, as you know, and there are different points of view, and there's different talents, and there's a lot of talent, and just as instead of having them as ones, having them as a group, just go from there.
That makes sense. So, standing at this point of time in your age, what do you think has been your regrets, your failures, specifically in this context?
Well, I'm going to go with the response that was given to you to that question by Lynn Elling. He couldn't respond to the failure question because he doesn't have failure in his vocabulary. He really does not have failure in his vocabulary. It's for him, and I've never really talked to him at any length about this, but I agree with his being is that for him there's never failure, there's only degrees of lack of success. so he's an old salesman, and there's the old thing about no is never no. No is just somebody's got some kind of question or concern that you can hopefully answer and then get to yes. So I think that in my limited way, I try to keep moving forward. If I was going to say I was a failure, I would quit. Well, to respond to the question about failure, I have a friend who you interviewed, Lynn Elling, and when you were interviewing him and I was listening to the interview, and you asked him that question, he wouldn't say he had a failure. And I've think that that's basically a good philosophy that I would like to have as well. He doesn't see that he failed, only he would consider himself a failure if he didn't try to succeed. And I think that's a good trait for people to have, that if you say you're failing, you've given up. And I'm not one who tends to quit. I told a group on Saturday, I was with another group, and I said when I was in the teachers union, there were endless problems that we had. There's always problems when you're in an organization. And one of the lessons that I learned was that persistence and patience pay off in the long run. If you persist in something, and if you allow enough time to pass, sooner or later something will happen positive out of it. You don't really, there's a lot of times in the process where you don't think you're getting anywhere. There's a lot of time in the process when you think you're going backwards. And then when you sit down 5 years later or 10 years later and look back, there's been a lot that's been accomplished. We used to have in bargaining for contracts, terms and conditions of employment, we would start out here and we would have aspirations up here. So we would get to here and people would say we failed. It's not a failure to me. You know, we succeeded. If we hadn't had these aspirations, we would not have gotten to this level. It's a matter of point of view, I guess.
So, as a final question, what message would you like to get recorded for public or youth?
For public generally, or?
Yes, for public in general, but youth in particular, a peace message.
Well, my message is to keep doing. And if you keep doing, you will ultimately succeed. If you have a passion for something, pursue that passion. And be willing to cooperate. There's a really bad word that really holds the whole peace movement back, and that's the business of compromising, where they will say, we can't compromise with our ideals. So I sit here with these dog tags from being in military service. You cannot succeed without acknowledging that there's people that have other points of view that have to be recognized, and you have to work within those other points of view to make any progress at all. Otherwise, you're just little, individual cells. With respect to youth, I was at a session at the Nobel Peace Prize Forum at Augsburg College back in March, and I was in a session with a lady who worked with Martin Luther King 50 years ago. And I asked her the question that it seemed like kids weren't interested very much in organizing things. Because that's, my environment isn't around kids anymore, except very limited basis. And just very recently, she wrote a long letter back to me where she said that isn't true at all. She said the kids are really energized. They're really energized in their issues, wherever they happen to be. We just aren't connected with their way of dealing with issues. It was really a hopeful sign for me. Because it's the kids that are going to inherit whatever it is that's left from us as time goes on. Hopefully it'll be something worthwhile, but they also have to assume the responsibility for making the world that they're coming into a good world or less than good. And I think that they're going to do a good job.
Thank you, Nick, for your time.